Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Emotional Intelligence Skills podcast. Today we will explore the true story of emotional intelligence. In conversation with EI practitioners David Caruso and Lisa Rees, we hear the true story of emotional intelligence, what it is, why they believe that the scientific hard skills EI ability model has the potential to help us all better navigate our changing world and reduce the negative impacts of the challenges we face as we transition through our daily lives. David Caruso is not a Hollywood actor and didn't appear in NYPD Blue. He's co-author of MSCEIT Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, co-author of the books Emotional Intelligent Manager, A Leader's Guide to Solving Challenges with Emotional Intelligence, Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence, co-developer and co-author of the Ruler Program, Anchors of Emotional Intelligence. He developed the Mood Meter and EI Blueprint, which are core aspects of EI training around the world, and has co-authored more than 50 chapters and scientific articles. David is the senior advisor to the Dean of Yale College and a research affiliate at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Lisa Rees is the co-author of A Leader's Guide to Solving Challenges with Emotional Intelligence and the Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence with David Caruso and David Adams. She has written several journal articles on emotional intelligence and appreciative inquiry. She's a leadership coach and instructor who previously worked for the US Citizenship and Immigration Services for over 30 years, leading teams in implementing financial systems and cost efficiencies throughout her agency before switching career fields to become a certified leadership coach in 2015. Lisa holds accounting and business management degrees from Chapman College and her master's in public administration from University. Lisa is certified in the MSCEIT Caruso Emotional Intelligence tool, as well as certified in appreciative inquiry and a number of leadership assessment tools. She is a strategic partner with the David L. Cooperide Center of Appreciative Inquiry and teaches emotional intelligence and appreciative inquiry at the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome, David and Lisa.
Thanks,
you,
Zena.
So how are you feeling this morning?
Well, it's a complex question, as we always say. You know, the how are you question is usually just not a question. So I'm going to pass that on to Lisa.
Thanks, David. That is a great question, because as soon as you said it, I wanted to respond immediately. And my first reaction was going to be, I'm great. How are you? But I also know that if I'm really being truthful, am I really great? And that is a much more complex question, as David alluded to.
And so maybe what I typically say, because, if you know someone not very well and you start with that reply to their how are you, the conversation can get pretty bizarre and strange very quickly. But, so I sometimes don't answer that real question, but I'm able to report now, Zena, to say, no matter what else is going on in the background of our lives and what's going on in the world in general for humanity, I'm pleased and mildly anxious to be here with you today. And that's a good, genuine response, and it's really kind of focused on what we're going to be trying to talk about.
Yeah, that's true for me. I'm also very excited to have this opportunity to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart with somebody I care deeply about. But yes, absolutely a little anxious and wondering how this is going to go. So I'm looking forward to it, though.
Thank you for being so honest.
And you?
How am I feeling?
Yeah.
A combination of excited and anxious. So anxious to do justice to this conversation and excited that we're having it, because I've got a lot of respect for the work. But thank you for asking.
And Zena, if I could just add, that, and that's great. I think sometimes a lot of people start, when we do our training, some people start nervously laughing, that nervous laughter of when we have this kind of conversation. But I think we're in an ideal frame of both that eager excitement of anticipation and a good dose of performance anxiety to make sure we stay focused and, and really really tell the story and do justice to it. So I think we're in a good place, emotionally at least, for this conversation.
Great. I feel like we set the right mood. And talking of mood, I know that you came up with something called the mood meter. Be interested to understand a little bit more about that and also how that came about. But before we get into that, I really want to go back to the early years of EI and explore how you were introduced to the world of emotional intelligence.
Many decades ago, I went to graduate school at Case Western Reserve in Ohio, and I studied intelligence theory. What is it? How do you measure it? How does it develop? And I met a fellow grad student named John D. or Jack Mayer, and he also was interested in the study of intelligence. We each went our separate ways. He did a postdoc at Stanford. I went to Yale to do a postdoc, and I met a young grad student, I guess he was still a grad student, named Pete Salovey. Jack and Peter met separately, and it was a real hybrid model of, Jack from an intelligence model, and Peter from a more perhaps of a social psychology model. And in conversations, they came up with this idea. I had since then, by then, left academia, and Jack just one day said, "Hey, you remember that guy Pete Salovey?" It was probably 1995. And I said, sure. And we're working on this thing called emotional intelligence. And I said, what's that? And he told me. And then he said, we know this journalist, he's writing the book and it's going to come out soon. And would you like to work with us on kind of applying this? So that's kind of the early years. It's both the research background in grad school, but what I really like about that is it's also about relationships. And those relationships span almost 40 years. That we've been, Jack and I talk every week. And so that's kind of how I got started. It was through relationships and friendships, as well as kind of that research training.
I remember reading somewhere that when Jack and Peter first developed the paper in 1988, when they first submitted it, the first feedback they got was that it was dangerous and they shouldn't publish it. Why do you think the reviewer may have felt that way about the paper at that time?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the danger was probably to their career, right? Don't talk about that stuff. Stay in your lane, and that's typical of so many fields, right? Just stay in your lane. You've got a body of research. You studied with these really, world-renowned researchers. Stay in your lane. What is this all about? Do we need just something new? And you also, perhaps then, you're a newly minted PhD. So what makes you think that you can actually kind of like send this world topsy-turvy? And, it's still a very controversial field. That is the field of intelligence in general. So probably, keep your head down. And that's probably the advice. And, look, it probably was really good advice at the time, but who knew? Who knew how that would all come about?
So your relationship with Jack and Peter, I've heard you talk about it before, and they are very important relationships to you. And the development of emotional intelligence became something that was important for you to make sure the integrity of the science was respected. Tell me a bit about that journey in terms of your emotional, I guess, connection to the concept and how your desire to protect it and the work that Jack and Peter kind of came alive in your practice.
I since I had left academia after my postdoc, I was supposed to be the marketing guy. How to explain this? Like what is this thing good for? And it may help to know that I come from a family. There are four of us. I have three brothers, and I think I still approach the world as if it's my family. And with my brothers, you fight for everything, and you really go after what you want. And I felt I was kind of the defender for Jack and Peter. And I think early on, I probably did some things and said some things, which I certainly now regret. They weren't politic. I was not politic in some of my remarks. But I was kind of fighting for them. I was fighting for their recognition and fighting to say, hey, these are the guys, pay attention to what they've said. It's really, really good. And you don't have to stretch the truth. Go to the source, really go to the source if you want to know. But I was definitely inelegant sometimes in the way that I would say that or write about it and so forth. And people still tell me stories like, I think it was 23 years ago when I first heard you speak, and you said, and they fill in the blank with something I said. And I usually just hold my head in shame, but I realized, I probably did say that. So, a fierce defender, I think I've matured just a wee bit, but not as much as I probably need to.
So you talk about emotional intelligence and the evolution of it being based on relationships. Be interested to understand from your perspective, Lisa, how you built a relationship with David, and how and why you were so passionate about getting more involved with the emotional intelligence.
Yeah, well, that is a complex story a little bit, just because when I was looking at doing my capstone for my master's back in 2010, I really, I was really fascinated around leadership and working in the federal government, working in bureaucratic environment with very resistant culture, resistant leaders. And, that was the first time, in all honesty, I had heard about emotional intelligence. And I mean, I'd heard a little bit about, Daniel Goleman's work and all that, but really the more I read about it, the more all the literature was saying the one that you really want to pay attention to is for assessment and research is the MSCEIT. So I reached out to David and said, hey, I see you're doing a certification class. This is back in 2010. And I said, I'd love to do my capstone on the need for emotional intelligence in the Department of Homeland Security. And, at that time, as you mentioned in my bio, I was doing finance and budget. And David was very honest with me. He's like, well, I'm not sure, Lisa, if you really need a full-blown certification. But I was relentless. And so living in Vermont, I traveled to Connecticut. I remember my flight being canceled and my husband saying, you got to get there. It was in Philadelphia. He put me on a train. I got in at 2 a.m. I was exhausted, but darn it, I was going to go because it was on the Yale campus, and I had never been to, to this campus. And so, in my eyes, David was a rock star. He was this image of, oh my gosh, he is, this co-creator of this tool, and I really believe in it. And I just remember sitting, listening to him, and I believe at the time his partner was Susan Kernacki, and he led this 3-day course. And I knew immediately, because I'm one of these people that I feel things deeply. And I remember having goosebumps. And I remember just going, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. And as I'm saying this, I actually have goosebumps on my arm because that's what it was. And so, trying to, look at him through he's a teacher, he's a rock star, he's a creator, and then trying to get to know David. And I have to admit, it was a little difficult because David, he, like you were talking earlier about, he's a protector. And I remember being terrified. I mean, I really was. I was anxious and terrified because I didn't want to screw it up. I wanted to be a good practitioner and somebody who would go back and spread the word and train people and develop people and coach people around it. And he was really a stickler, for the words we used and making sure we understood the model and how much care we had to give in the feedback, because we didn't want to give, sell it and, like snake oil. We wanted to say, this is what the tool is and what it isn't. And so he really took his time to do that. And when I left there, I knew I wanted to continue this work. So there's more, Zena, but basically it was me being persistent, going back to him saying, hey, would you help me with this PowerPoint presentation? Or I want to do a keynote and I'm worried. Could you look at it? And David was always the one saying, yes, this is, I hear some recommendations. He always emailed me back. And I just kept showing up in his email. And eventually, when Susan moved away, he's like, hey, would you like to help me out and maybe, help me do a certification? I wasn't certified and to certify others, but I was, a partner with him. And that's when our relationship started to unfold. And it did take me a couple years to really get to know David. And now I just can't say enough. He's like, he's going to blush and he's not going to like this, but he's like a brother to me. And notice, David, I didn't say uncle or father. He's like a brother to me. So we have a very interesting relationship because he and I have different personalities and different styles, but together, I think it works really well. And I'm really happy to be part of this, I call it a movement.
So, David, would you say that becoming the Obi-Wan Kenobi of EI is what kind of happened over the course of many years based on you trying to protect the integrity of the concept?
No, I have no idea, but it's, what Lisa says is really interesting. Like, how do you both be really excited about how important and applicable the model is to pretty much everything you do, but without like losing touch with those roots or, being grounded, I guess, as well, right? You never want someone to say that they're a fan of EI. I hear that sometimes. I never want to hear someone say they love using the MSCEIT, or they believe it's whatever. I call that faith-based assessment. And there's a place for faith in our lives, but not when it comes to this stuff. So it's this weird balance, if you will, between, yeah, I'd love for people to know about this. And I think it's really enormously helpful. But how do you say that? And still be grounded and still say, however, the correlation between performance and emotional intelligence as measured by the MSCEIT is R.23. It's not the most important thing in the world, and which is probably about right. So I've never figured that out. It's really, really difficult. And one of the great things about working with Lisa these last, I guess, more than 10 years is that, she respects that, and is able to, much better than I am, to kind of explain this stuff and make it come alive and apply it, but without kind of going beyond those bounds of, and becoming ridiculous about some of the claims and things. It's really hard to do well. And I think she pulls it off. So I've let Lisa into my circle of trust as a result of all that.
So building on that, when we think about what we've described as the EQ gold rush years, it would be good to qualify, what is the difference? Is there a difference? Is EI the same as EQ? And if not, what is EI and what is EQ?
Well, it's, to us, they're really different things. And what they have in common is some of the language and the terms, but they're really different. And one of the things I've tried to do is when I talk about EQ is to try to be balanced. And it's still a bit of a Rorschach or an ink plot. You read into it what you think is, what you see. And for the most part, it's really interesting and it predicts important stuff. But, in my view, it's what's been studied for many, 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 many decades, and that's standard personality traits. So optimism and assertiveness, those are really important things in our lives. But it's not necessarily a skill. I don't see it that way. It's not about intelligence. I guess it tangentially touches on emotion, but emotional intelligence is a standard intelligence. It's what's, intelligence theorists call a broad intelligence. It's related to general intelligence. That in and of itself is really, really important. right? Because you don't have to trade off analytical ability for emotional intelligence. It's not one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game. Another thing that I really like to say this, which is we look at emotions as data. It's a form of information. Even to the point where how we opened up, which is we're all a little excited and also anxious. Well, you're not supposed to be anxious, right? Well, depends. So emotional intelligence is a standard intelligence. It's a set of 4 hard skills. We don't do soft skills work. It's a hard skill. It's an intelligence. It's reading people's emotions. It's feeling those emotions and matching the mood to the task, as we've just done. It's understanding why you feel the way we feel. And I think we probably know why. We all feel the way we feel right now. And then managing those emotions. And managing does not mean suppressing and squashing and repressing those. Sometimes it means getting mad. Sometimes it means to light a fire under people. Sometimes it means that sadness is adaptive and it's really helpful. So to me, it's a set of hard skills, which is also pretty cool because it means, you could probably learn those skills. I'm not sure if you can learn to be more optimistic or happier and so forth. So I think that's how I perceive it.
Lisa, it'd be interesting to understand your perspective and then also how emotional intelligence comes alive in your practice and the difference you've seen it make to your clients.
Yeah. Just listening to David explain it, it's a lot for people to wrap their head around because they're so entrenched in the EQ model that they have a really hard time thinking that it's an ability. And it also can be anxiety producing, especially for the executives that I coach, because they've already done their EQ self-assessment. They even got a 360 EQ and they're dynamic, they have great personalities, they're positive, they make great leaders, and they also struggle with relationships, with building trust, with connection, with emotional empathy. And therefore, they may speak the language of emotional intelligence using, a rich emotional vocabulary, but if they're missing the data, as David says, boy, they're missing a lot. And what I am noticing is that people say, I have too much work to do. We got to reach a goal. We got to, move out. We have to, we're behind budget, whatever. And so when they walk into a meeting, they don't even consider sometimes people's emotions. And what they do is either, they overlook it, they don't read people, they can't see emotion in people or read a room, and then they end up acting inappropriately. They say things that are hurtful and leads to mistrust. And they're not really showing up as what people need. And people say, well, if you don't care about me, and this is something I've noticed with COVID as well. This pandemic has been very challenging with connections. And I think that being able to tap into people's emotional state is really important. So I'm noticing now that there's more receptiveness of leaders, executives, professionals, anybody who wants to be successful. They recognize that EI is really important. And because they've done the EQ thing, they think that, I've already done that. But what David alluded to was that when you give somebody the MSCEIT or when you share this model with them, they actually go, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that emotions are data and that it really matters how I'm feeling, how my team's feeling, and that I need to consider this. And I need to also maybe show some emotional empathy or at least cognitive empathy before I move to the last part, which is manage my emotion. So what's been a little challenging for me is to differentiate between the EQ and EI because there's so many EQ practitioners out there and so many people, my colleagues who are certified in EQ, who say, I've already done that. And so until they actually experience it or want to learn, it's difficult to get people to I hate to say try it on, but it is like listen to, a podcast, listen to, read our book. And then all of a sudden you start to understand, because I think where we differ is that because of the research behind the mesquite and the longevity of the mesquite and about these emotions or data, that we can connect to more people. And when I say that, I say it from experience, because when I'm teaching out at the Naval School and I'm teaching people from Homeland Security, from FEMA, from police departments, fire departments, I just did a recent one for meteorologists. And when you talk to them in that science language, when you talk to them about, the psychometrics, they're like, wow, we never viewed emotions like this before. And they walk away with something. And that's the most gratifying thing that I've learned, that I've experienced in my practice.
So the description or articulation that both of you have of emotional intelligence, my understanding, isn't the most popular in terms of popularized version. And so during the EQ Gold Rush years, I understand, David, you were asked to provide endorsements to people's books or practices. Many of those you turned down. Talk a bit about that period where, in some ways, you may have become a bit of an outsider to a concept that you were supporting in the very early days.
I have to think about that. You can be supportive of people in their work, but sometimes people would just ask me for my opinion about what they were doing, and I don't think they oftentimes maybe wanted an opinion. It was more of what you said, which is, I want an endorsement, right? This is really cool. And I mean, you have to be somewhat grounded in some values. Like, what do you value? And I think I'm still trying to figure out my own values, but I value being truthful, I guess. And how can you be both truthful to just in general, but also, just not say things that to make people feel good. So this is incredibly inarticulate, and I'm kind of realizing that now. But I don't think people ask me anymore sometimes. Occasionally they will, and I think I probably have a better explanation now. And sort of Lisa did a really good job of what is emotional intelligence. And I think now I just try to focus on what it is, not what it's not. And that's a lesson I probably should have learned 20 years ago, and it took me that long to kind of figure that out. So I think going forward, I really try to be a little more polite, I guess, as well, but kind of be truthful, and just say, I really don't feel what you're doing is related in kind of any way to either emotions or intelligence, and or to emotional intelligence. And I can tell you why if you're interested. And not everybody wants to follow up on that, after that little intro.
I've actually seen a shift in you, David, honestly, since I've met you, because you're right. In the beginning, you were a fierce defender. And if anybody kind of sullied, what it was, or wasn't articulate, or just like you said in the beginning about saying, I love this model and, oversold it, that I noticed that it was really offensive to you, and that you would either say something which didn't usually go over well, or you would just not say anything at all. And I understand why you did that, but then I think as we work together, we came together to say, well, let's just focus on what it is and not what it's not. And that if those practitioners that you certified, or who are in EQ and not EI, don't get it, that's not on you, because whenever you train, develop people around the mesquite model, it's very clear what it is and what it is not. And so being a marketer, You know, people want to touch people's heartstrings and give them this golden ticket, you know, and to say it's the end all be all. If you come to me, this is what's going to happen. And you're going to, that's why in the beginning, if you recall, I mean, people were saying that it was more important than IQ, which we know is not accurate and since has been taken back by many people. But now I think what we've done is explained what it is and what it's not. We don't oversell it. We say that it's interesting. It's a piece of who you are. It's not everything of who you are. It's a piece of who you are. And that you can learn about it and you can practice it. And with feedback, you might get better. So now we are, more people are open, I believe, to the messaging. And you have done an incredible, you know, you're a great messenger now. And you have learned and you have changed. And, but you'll never change those people who want to continue overselling it. And that's on them.
So this is one of those things which, of course, as soon as I'm done, I will regret. But, you know, I am trying to be a little more polite, but it was probably just a few years ago where someone, you know, walked out of one of our courses because I could not restrain myself. I tried to be, you know, kind about it, but it was more of that. Why do people lose their perspective and objectivity when they're talking about this stuff? And it does still kind of drive me crazy. So, but I've said some things over the 25 years I've been doing this, which is I deeply regret. It was really, you know, wasn't something I should not have done. But and I've learned a little bit, but not enough, because it was only a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, where, you know, just think about what you're saying and look at the research, look at the data. Don't engage in faith-based practices when you're doing this kind of work. That's just wrong. That's just plain wrong. I can hear it in my voice now. So it's that edge that I have that I kind of love, actually. I love honing that edge as well. So again, it goes back to my three brothers. It's always a conversation with my brothers, or a fight or an argument, which I still love to this day. So
I think that's really interesting in terms of this idea of the ability and the practice. And in the middle of that, there's a conversation around the importance of understanding your values, some of your biases potentially, and your intention. So I'm interested to hear from your perspectives. How do you navigate that in terms of, as you build your EI ability, making sure that it's used as a tool for good rather than manipulation or some of the other non-positive things?
I like what David says when people ask him this question. They asked me too, but I got it from David um, about using EI for nefarious reasons, for manipulation, for, you know, whatever reason, but for malintent. And his answer was, if you're truly emotionally intelligent, you would never do that. You just wouldn't do that, because EI is built around relationships and trust and empathy. How can you manipulate people when that's who you are? So could somebody be high in EI and manipulate? Absolutely. Absolutely they could. But truly, you know, they use it for malintent, and there's much bigger issues going on than their EI ability.
And to add to that, Lisa, I mean, look, there's a couple of studies out there where people scoring high on our assessment, especially the managing of emotions piece, who are also, I believe, high on what's called Machiavellianism, which is also a misunderstood concept, do use that skill for nefarious purposes. Absolutely. But I think, Lisa, what you said is really on target, because if you're high on all four of those abilities, that includes empathy. And if I realize that I'm causing you some pain, I'm not going to do that. And I realize it because also I'm mapping and perceiving your emotions. And then I take those on. And then I understand, oh my gosh, what I just said or what I just did is deeply hurtful to that individual. Let me go back and apologize. Let me take that deep breath. So again, there is a subset of people who can use this for evil and malintent. But man, if you're firing on all four cylinders with those four skills and abilities, you're not going to be, at least intentionally, you're not going to mess with people. You're there to make people's lives better. And when you don't, you just feel pretty rotten about it, and then use that rotten feeling to motivate yourself to go back and fix it and make it right, because it is about relationships. It's not transactions. So just keep that in mind, though. I mean, there is some of those studies out there that support that contention that you could use it for bad intent.
So I'd like to ask a question around emotions generally. So a lot of times emotions are prescribed to being good or bad, negative or positive. And as you just described as well, that sometimes we may have the ability, but we just choose not to use it. What would your perspective be in terms of classifying emotions as good and bad, and generally in your life where you feel like you've had the ability but you've chosen not to use it, and what's the driver of that in terms of your experience?
Well, I know for me, the way that I was brought up, and in school, there were things, be emotions that you didn't do, and they were labeled, and it was good or bad. And now, as I get older, now we call it negative and positive. And I do a lot around positive psychology, and I believe in, positive psychology. I think it's really important. But as we said in the beginning, and what I say when I'm training people, developing people, I say there are no good or bad emotions. They can really be helpful. All emotions can be helpful if they're used in the right manner, if they're used for good purpose, if they're helpful to you. Because the second part of emotional intelligence is matching your emotion to the goals and the environment and the tasks at hand. So there are times, yes, do I like to be positive? Absolutely. And I think that that's where I want, and I always say, like, where do you hang out on the mood map, the mood meter? Where are you? I hang out in that high positivity, high energy area. And I also know that there are times when I can't, and it's because of what's going on in my life. And so for me, I don't say that's a bad emotion. And even though I was trained, like even in my early days working, I was told, Lisa, there's no room for tears here. There's no crying. There's no yelling. We don't want to see frustration. They only wanted us to smile and to be pleasant all the time. And I was trained that that's what I needed to do. And that's how I showed up a lot, because I was the head of teams, the head of, all these projects. And it was my job to be the cheerleader, to be the rah-rah person. And when things all of a sudden start to go south, when you're over budget, when people are quitting, when people are burnt out, if I continued there, I'm not reading people. I'm not even taking that into consideration. So what I've really invited to my team, my colleagues, is I want to know how you are. When I say, how are you? Please tell me. If I miss it, I want to know. Because if we're not in the best place, then how do we take a pause? What do we do to get to the root cause and then manage that emotion? When I'm not feeling positive, and I'm feeling in the more anxious or frustrated or sad, I share that because I've built enough trust with my colleagues, friends, teams, and that I can say, I'm kind of sad today, and this is why. And again, I get a lot of support and love, and it's actually a good thing. So I think it's really important for us to understand there is no such thing as good and bad. It's just these are your emotions. And if you can tap into why you're feeling the way you are and what can you do, what strategies will you use, then that's really why this model works so well. So I invite everybody to be open to all emotions. Don't shut out those things that you consider bad emotion. Because sometimes people think bad emotion can be positive too. I know a lot of people that shut down on me when I'm positive even. So again, I think all should be welcome.
David, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, emotions are data, right? So to get a little deeper, just a couple of things to think about. So we used to use positive, negative, and then we say more unpleasant, pleasant. That's a lot better, I think. It's just better language for reasons Lisa mentioned. But emotions are data, so it's not bad. I mean, I always ask people, one of the things that Lisa mentioned this, but really bears repeating is the model works best with really analytical people, whether you're an accountant or an engineer, military, IT, law, scientists, because I think we're research based. We haven't lost touch with that. We look at emotions as data and we say, do you want less information about what's happening or more? And so far, no one said, well, we'd like less information. So if emotions are data, how can they be negative or positive? It's a sign, it's information. Where people get messed up is just going with their feelings, right? And so a great way to look at it, and there's a wonderful article written a few years ago by an amazing researcher named Sigal Barsade, who unfortunately passed away earlier in 2022. And she talks about this so articulately, which is we have a feeling, a physical feeling. Don't necessarily go with that. My spin on that means because the feeling can be an emotion, something happened, it's data, or it could be a mood. And moods can mess us up and screw up our lives. So, like, this is not true, but let's say last night I didn't get a lot of sleep. Something else happened and I'm kind of over caffeinated and then I'm a little sharp with you. Zena, what are you talking about? Well, that's not an emotion because that's not something, my reaction is not because of what you did or said. It's me. So the feeling of annoyance or irritation, I got to be really careful and think about, like, where did that come from? And then realize, it's me. It's I gotta manage that away, as opposed to if you're in a situation and someone did something or said something, and that was really insulting, that was hurtful, that was trying to erase me. If I could filter out whatever mood I'm in from that feeling of erasure, the residual that's left, that anger, that's data. And that's not a negative emotion. That's something that I'm going to leverage and power me through to effect change and make and just fix that and address that issue. So emotions are data, feelings are not facts necessarily.
So you talk about moods, feelings, and emotions. And earlier on in your bio, we talked about the mood meter. Can you tell us a bit more about how that came about?
I was just thinking about this recently, which is, I think the first time that we took the model outside of the lab was in October of 1996. Somehow, Jack Mayer got invited to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and he said, hey, they need another speaker. So, and that's where I quickly learned, I asked people using the model, how are you feeling? And the answers are, great, good, fine, okay. Well, that wasn't the answer I was looking for because that didn't really help. And what I realized is we need a kind of a quick and handy way for people to kind of refer to how they felt and give them some support. So, there's a longstanding theory that emotions consist of two dimensions, how pleasant you are and how much energy you have. Now, scientists call it activation and valence, but that kind of doesn't go over well with the general public. So we just plotted this out and put some numbers to it and just said, now, rather than giving me the words, give me a couple of numbers. Where do you plot yourself on this mood meter? And it was a lot easier for people to do and a lot less threatening because they just didn't have even when they thought about the question, we don't have the language. We don't have the vocabulary. So let's make it easy for people. And since then, however long ago that was, and then soon after, we went, Jack, Peter, and I went to Tokyo a few times, and we realized I could ask the same question to audiences in Tokyo, and realizing, hey, this is actually kind of cool. It can work, and it's a lot less threatening. And since then, it's been used a lot, and I think usually pretty well.
Do you use the mood meter, Lisa?
I use it all the time. And well, when I say all the time, when I'm doing team building, there are quite a few, because I work again with a lot of people who think that emotions are, unicorns and rainbows. Like, why do we really need that? It's the touch, people will roll their eyes and say, oh, here comes the touchy feely person. And so I've already, when I show up, they already have this sometimes a negative opinion of what I'm about to do. But then once I start to go into it and talk about emotions or data, and they don't want to give me an emotion word, because I say, how are you? And I always get fine, good. And then the sarcastic, great. And I'm like, okay. And they just kind of, make me work hard to try to change their mind, so to speak. But when I start then to put the mood meter up, the mood map up, and I just say, hey, give me your where you are with feeling, and where are you with energy? And all of a sudden you've gotten their attention. And they don't have to now say that they're content or joyful or anxious or fearful. They can actually just give me a number. And then when I share with them what David was mentioning about how they track and what the words might, the emotion words behind it, a light bulb goes off and they're like, yeah, okay, this is interesting. So I do use it. I also used it when I was overseeing a team. We were in Washington, D.C., Vermont, California. And when I was after I came back from David's, MSCEIT certification, I shared with them the mood map and said, hey, I want to share this with you. And I walked them through the model. And I said, I'm curious about, how are you? And could you answer that and tell me what zone you're in, what quadrant you're in? And, some people would be like, oh, I'm kind of red, yellow today, or I'm yellow, high yellow, or low yellow, whatever. And that just really helped me. And while they laughed about it, they really were interested to see how their colleagues were doing. And I would ask people, like, where do you typically hang out? Like, where do you hang out typically? And for me, I mentioned earlier that I'm a positive person. I typically hang out in the yellow. So when I asked people where they hung out, I would say to them before I would start a meeting, are there any changes, that you want to share in your mood map? Because then they would be like, I'm not feeling the yellow. I'm feeling the red right now. And then it would be a conversation. So yeah, I think it's you'll notice on, in our book, on our business cards, all the material we have, you'll see that mood map everywhere, because it is such a foundational tool, I feel, for leadership development, personal development.
One thing we're doing more, though, I guess 25 years on, is advancing the question a little bit. What we're also finding, people's lives are complicated. And so sometimes you can't just plot it on that graph. And so with clients, we're not just showing this graphic, but we're overlaying words. And we ask them to pick as many as they want. And sometimes they're really different, because you have to think about even about a specific meeting. Maybe you're both anxious and a little excited, or maybe you're frustrated because the meeting was canceled. So it's kind of a remedial device, if you will. But we really like to move people along to think more deeply about these things. And our it's a complex topic. So let's give them the language to come up with it. And in a workbook, Lisa and I developed, we do just that for people. We give them, I think, Lisa, something along the lines of 100 words or something.
Yeah. I was
Yeah.
just looking, I just grabbed our workbook, and we have a workbook called Developing Your Emotional Intelligence Skills in our appendix. And this was so interesting. I had a client who could not identify a word. They were actually low in understanding the reason, the understanding the meaning of emotion. So couldn't really grasp the word they were looking for, but they had their energy number and they had their pleasantness number. And so what I did is I referred to the emotion words too. And I just like kind of went over some of these words with them, and they were able to find the word that really described it and said, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. So again, I think that it's important to overlay the words and help people to really articulate the word, because there is such a big difference between being mad, because I hear that all the time. Oh, I'm so mad. And I'll be like, are you annoyed? Are you frustrated? Are you really angry? And sometimes it is anger, but usually not. It's usually just something, like David was saying, might have been building from a mood that all of a sudden turned into a cause of what happened, and then we can really have a good conversation around it.
So when we think about the buzzwords that we have, particularly in the world of work at the moment, or buzz phrase, is creating these psychologically safe environments, particularly in the landscape of the changing world, people having to navigate the various different identities and groups of people that they may not have traditionally engaged with. How do you think EI, if at all, particularly with the books that you've written, could potentially provide a roadmap or an approach to navigating this world?
I want you to answer that question, Zena. I mean, you were brilliant at applying the model in that way.
So I'm just going to pause because I wasn't expecting that response. Uh, so okay, what I've learned and what I've experienced from my own personal experience is that as someone who's would be considered as a minority in many spaces in the work environment, um, experiencing that environment of being sometimes the only person, or feeling that you're misunderstood, or potentially having to align yourself with the emotions that are expected based on people's kind of stereotypical ideas of who you are and what you represent. Um, it often becomes a big load to carry. And so there becomes a lot of dissonance and potential kind of frustration in that environment. So having the ability to then access the strategic component of that, in terms of being able to sort of understand the context and then figure out ways to sort of better navigate that, for me personally, has been a survival tool in many ways. And having a framework in order to compartmentalize and use that has been helpful for me. I think in general in the workforce, one of the things I'm passionate about is everybody having access to that framework to be able to pause and mindfully check their biases, and also create space to think about the things that are giving them or creating cognitive dissonance in the workplace, that sometimes can drive biases and sometimes drive behaviors related to those that can be damaging for people who are minorities in those spaces. So my perspective is that this framework can be extremely powerful in terms of increasing self-awareness and helping people to more self-reflectively think about how they use their privilege and power to create those psychologically safe spaces.
Brilliantly stated. Thanks.
So part of this journey, when we talk, I've talked to you a lot about the legacy of EI. And I feel in the conversations with you and Lisa that your meeting and developing of these books was a purposeful connection in many ways. For both of you, what is the future of, number one, EI skills, and the legacy that both of you want to leave with the work that you're doing around emotional intelligence.
Well, first a note about the 3 books that Lisa and I now have. They would have been written probably 2.5 years sooner, but it took, I think, about 2 years for Lisa to convince me to do it. So I thought it was a really terrible idea. I just, like, why would you want to do that? No, it's just, I mean, it was like, why? I mean, really, I see no need to do that. Like, why would you want to like explain this in a clear and concise manner? Sort of what I was thinking. Boy, that yeah, but it took, I think it took about 2 years of cajoling, convincing, and are you sure? And until it got to the point where it was just easier to say yes. I was not convinced. I still thought it was not a great idea, but it was like, she's just not going to go away. So let me just agree. It was a really good decision. I'm sorry that I was so stubborn in my refusal to do it. And it's been great because, you know, the feedback we get is like, "Yeah, this was really clear. I found this really helpful. It was very concrete. Yeah, I can relate to this kind of stuff." And that's all Lisa's doing. So I'd love to see the model broadly applied and done well and not used for force of, you know, to support the forces of evil out in the world. One of the things that I do want to be careful about is when, you know, I still do workshops and training. I actually think they're valuable to raise awareness. You know, it's a good first step. But what I've been telling people is it's also unfair to teach people these skills and then throw them back into a toxic culture. You know, we're not fixing the root causes of these issues. And that's been driving me nuts. And it's angering me, really, to see what we're doing. I mean, I still think it's good. Let's enhance your skills, emotion management and things like that. But it seems almost unfair to then, and inefficient from a business point of view, to then put people back into that toxic culture. So how do you do that? How do you fix it? And maybe we can convince, you know, it's kind of like one mind at a time. Maybe that's the legacy. Can we fix the culture? Because it's makes such a huge difference. So also, so big thanks, Lisa, for not giving up. And
I tell you, I'm not going away, and I keep showing up. Because it was kind of funny, like when David and Susan were co-teaching, or, you know, doing the certification class, David handed out the book, The Emotionally Intelligent Manager, and I read it cover to cover, and I thought it was really good. It had a lot of information, good information. And it was, you know, lengthy, and I'm not saying long, you know, compared to some of these novels you see, but it was a dense book. Um, and so I know who my clients were going to be. It was people that didn't have a lot of time, who really, I hate to say this, but didn't care too much about the research, really. You know, they just wanted something to understand. And so when David, I love David's inscription. I always joke with him about it because, you know, when you have an author and you're starstruck, and I was, like I said, I always thought that David's a rock star. And it's like, David, would you sign your book, please? So he did. And he wrote on the front, "Best of luck," exclamation point. And that was it. Just best of luck, David Caruso. And I was like, what does that mean exactly? Best of luck. Is it like, but it was kind of funny. So I kept showing up and saying,
well, wait a
David,
minute. What would you
what?
want someone to write in there?
Well,
Like,
I
have a
don't know.
terrible
It was
life?
really, no, but it
But
was really, it
that's,
was really nice
come
having you in
on.
class. Thanks for, you know, for
I
I don't know, just, you know, anything, but just best of luck just sounded kind of like, okay, I get it,
I
I
thought it was
guess.
pretty good. All
All
right.
right, thank
All right.
you.
All right.
Anyhow,
Well,
so I was like, David, you know, come on. People are asking me for exercises, and we had some, you know, we did a few exercises, and but I wanted to like write them out. So I did. I would write them out and I'd send them to David and say, hey, for managing emotion, what do you think of these exercises? And before you knew it, we had many exercises. So I said, David, let's do a book. You know, it'll be a quick read. You know, it'll contain all the information. We can hand it out. He mentioned about being in charge of marketing, which is kind of funny because David's not a huge self promoter, but I said we could use it for marketing, we could use it for development, we could use it for all these purposes. So he finally relented, and we both are really happy with it. And when I give it out, and David, I know you have the same experience, people love getting the book. They just love it. We teach the class, they get the book, they say thank you. I have something I can take with me now. I can go back to it. I have some exercises. But David was really what he mentioned about toxic environments is true. I did feel a little bad. I was so excited to be training this in a federal government setting. And I was asked to do this class over and over and over because it became really popular. But what people would say to me was, yeah, this is great for us, but what about our bosses? Are they going to get trained in this? And I was like, oh, yeah. And then I started separating bosses, supervisors from employees so that people could be truthful and honest. And it was clear that there was a disconnect and that there was a lot more development that needed to happen. So I did feel a little guilty, even though I said, hey, I'm on staff, you can come see me. But it just did not evolve the way I was hoping. And so now that I'm no longer with the government, I only work with people, with companies who really want to make change from the top down. If they don't believe in it, if it's not the CEO, the C-suite doing it, I'm not going to really, do too much development because I don't want to leave people hanging. And I think, David, you're right. It's really important that we don't do that, and that we give people, it's a lifeline, but you got to continue talking about it and having the support. And like you said, Zena, about psychological safety, there's so many unsafe environments out there that it's really unfortunate. So if everybody could learn this model, what a better place, the world would be.
Thank you for your time today, David and Lisa. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to close with?
I just want to thank you, Zena, for giving us this opportunity to share it. I really didn't think that I should be involved at all because as I still have that rock star mentality that David and what he has done. And by, yes, Jack and Peter, introduced us to it, but David was the one who, assisted with the MSCEIT and then really helped others become certified and to develop people. Um, and so just to be part of this podcast is really, I want to thank both of you for that. And I'm really excited about where we're headed, and where David and I and anybody, and like yourself, Zena, as well, like, where will this go? What will it lead to? And how can we just continue this wonderful work that Peter and Jack started and that David cares so deeply about? So I still have a lot of appreciation for this man.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge people's contributions. So, Lisa, invaluable partner and colleague and friend, deeply appreciate what you've done. Zena, your application of stuff is amazing. I am gobsmacked when I think of some of the stuff that you have done. Had to throw that phrase in there. And, over the years, we've gotten a lot of support and help, but, early on, person named Charles Chuck Wolf was very helpful to me, and want to acknowledge him, and like pushing the envelope of my brain to think about this. Susan Kornacki early on was also super helpful in actually helping me to think about applying these concepts more broadly. And it's really important for me. I've mentioned, Jack Mayer and Peter Salovey, but what's also important to mention is that they are researchers, they're academics, and I want to make sure that I'm not representing them in this podcast. The only times that would be true is when we would be co-authors on an article. So it's a bit of a disclaimer to also make sure that I can't speak for others. I can only speak for myself, and that's very, very important to me, because once you start blurring those lines, then I think that's part of what we call integrity. And I want to be very careful about that, and also naming some names who've been really helpful and pushed me in the past. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Zena.
Thank you.